Well, thank you all for coming out tonight on this rainy night. And I promise you, this is going to be such a good discussion. You are going to forget that it's raining out there, because I know that there's going to be a really hot debate in here, and I'm looking forward to it. Stephen's introduced people to some extent, and we're going to hear from Avner in a moment. But I just wanted to say a little more about our two fabulous authors, who also happen to be two, actually, of my own favourite, personal favourite authors. Firstly, our very own, as Stephen mentioned, our Sydney Pulitzer Prize winner, former foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. She's a Harvard graduate. She's a best-selling author of fiction and non-fiction. She's an officer of the Order of Australia, the legendary Geraldine Brooks. And Assaf Gavron has a few strings to his bow too. He's one of Israel's most celebrated and multi-prize winning authors, and he is a man of very many talents. He's also a former journalist. Clearly there's not that much to that. Anyone can do that. He's a literary translator. He's a singer and songwriter. He's the captain of the Israeli Writers football team. He's the creator of video games that intend to show people how to bring peace to the Middle East. He's the author of Israel's most famous collection of falafel reviews. And most of all, he's a writer who pulls off what I think is the most impossible feat of all, which is writing about some of Israel's most difficult subjects, like settlements and suicide bombings, in a way that's not only brutally honest, but is genuinely funny. He's quite amazing. Congratulations, Assaf. Now, I know that a lot of you are going to be bursting to ask questions, and we are going to make plenty of time for questions. We have 2 microphones here, and I'll let you know when it's time for that. But first of all, let's hear from our panel, and let's start with Avner. And Stephen mentioned it a bit, but maybe you could tell people a bit more about Breaking the Silence and how it came into being.
So thank you so much for that, Debbie, and thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to the New Israel Fund for putting this all together. It's been an amazing couple of days. So, breaking the silence. What silence we've been trying to break? I think that for the guys that started Breaking the Silence back in 2004, the silence that they experienced was what they saw, did, were ordered to carry out during the Second Intifada. First Palestinian uprising, 87 till 91. Second Palestinian uprising or Intifada starting September 2000. And this specific group of soldiers were serving in Hebron, which is one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and the only Palestinian city today that has an Israeli settlement in the heart of it. So about 700 Israelis, the vast majority of them religious, guarded by about 650 soldiers. And during their service in the Second Intifada in Hebron, they served through one of the most difficult and bloodiest moments in that Second Intifada for almost 8 months straight. Many Israelis remember the killing, the murder of a 10-month-old baby named Shalhevet Pas, who was a child who was Israeli, killed by a Palestinian sniper. People forget, but also important to remember a Palestinian teenager named Libim Jamjoum was also killed during the vicinity of that time, not necessarily in those 8 months, but during that time in Hebron, and there was constant curfew, arrest operations, constant friction between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the soldiers who were serving there tried on a bunch of different occasions and their weekends out to share their experiences. Many of them around the Friday night dinner table. And they realized, first individually, but then collectively, that there's no real space to talk about what they're asked to do as soldiers. And when the first batch of them, first bunch of these soldiers finished their service at the beginning of 2004, they said, we have to do something with this. And they collected their own photos and photos of their friends who served alongside with them, and collected each other's testimonies. And they put this on display in a photo exhibit in Tel Aviv, And they said, let's see who will come. And the thing was, and this I think was what allowed Breaking the Silence to continue, was that there was a moment there inside the Israeli society that allowed that conversation to happen, and thousands came to meet these soldiers. This was so successful that they showed this exhibit in other places around the country and were even invited into the Knesset, into the Israeli parliament. But the interest of the public and the understanding that there are also other soldiers who didn't serve with them, but served in different places and in different times and could share similar experiences, pushed them to form this organization called Breaking the Silence. And pretty much ever since, we've been doing two things. One is meeting new soldiers. Every year we meet between 60, 70 to 100 soldiers a year who serve in the last couple of years. And we gather their testimonies, and we're sort of a platform for their experiences. And the second thing we do is we do educational work. So events like this, talks, screenings of movies, and maybe some of the people here in the crowd have been with us to Hebron and to the South Hebron Hills, where we can actually take people to the places we served ourselves and show people the reality from our own eyes and from our own experiences. And we're actually, in the community in Israel, one of the, not one, but the leading organization in the terms of numbers of people we meet, numbers of Israelis we meet. So we have about 500 different educational events annually, so there's constantly something happening. This was with a lot of pushback from our government, but we are very proud of that work and happy with the people that reach out to hear us.
One of the other big things you do, of course, is to collect testimonies from soldiers about their experience in the occupied territories, and that ranges from anonymous testimonies to testimonies that people will show their faces on, and events that have concerned them across the whole range of things, from major crimes to lesser things. I mean, can you talk more about that, and also what impact that has had on Israeli society?
So I myself served as a paratrooper in one of the special units of the paratrooper brigade. I grew up in a city called Rehovot in Israel. I grew up in an Orthodox family and went to yeshiva till 12th grade, and after a year of community service joined the army. I joined with, I think, many questions, but with a lot of belief, right? Thinking, you know, I have a responsibility to give back to my country, to my people, and protect my family. I have to say, on a side note, I feel that the work that we do in Breaking the Silence is motivated exactly from that same cause. What we're trying to do is to better our country and our society. But the men and women that have joined Breaking the Silence, similar to me, have all served themselves. About over 1,100 soldiers have met us. 20% of them are female soldiers. About a third, more or less, are officers. And the testimonies that we have gotten from soldiers throughout the years have varied, right? Some of the testimonies are really maybe like what some of you could imagine happens in the occupation: brutal use of violence, misusing weapons, beating up Palestinians. This is part of the reality of a 51-year military occupation, and it's very clear, and we say often, you can't have an occupation without violence. You have to use violence in order to maintain a military control over people who don't want to be controlled. But if I have to classify the kinds of testimonies we get, you know, one kind is really what maybe many of you will have in mind. Things that you'll find in our testimonies, things that I saw throughout my service: using force against Palestinians, slapping a Palestinian when he's handcuffed in a jeep.
Do you want to tell the story of the moment when you looked into someone's eyes and thought, why am I doing this?
Yeah. So that was definitely, I would say, you know, that moment, for example, wasn't one of those moments. So you have those kinds of testimonies, which, in my eyes, aren't the problem; they're the symptom. But you have a different kind of testimony that we get, where soldiers are ordered to do something which is against army regulation. But I think the third and most important kind of testimony is what you refer to are the regular routine orders soldiers are given. So one of the experiences, or one of the testimonies that I gave, was about a mission that I carried out, and I was ordered to carry out, and later on I ordered soldiers to carry out myself as a sergeant of a sniper's team. It's a mission that we call the Straw Widow, in Hebrew, Almanat Kash. You basically take over a private Palestinian house and use that house as a military post. So we would check in advance, make sure that that house has the good enough windows looking into the right direction in the heart of a city or in the edge of a village. You would check in advance that the people inside the house are innocent, right, or not involved, as we called it. And then you would use that house as a military post. Now, there was always a rationale for that. Right, there was, we were supposed to look for a specific vehicle, or search for gunmen, or protect people on the ground. We always had the rationale for doing that. But we also knew that the people that were barging into in the middle of the night were not involved in what was happening on the ground. And specifically, these experiences were things that I went through almost every evening, but there was this one house in Nablus where we entered the house of a physician, a doctor. It was called the House of the Doctor. And we get to this house, barge into the house in the middle of the night, and this old man is trying to prevent me and the rest of my team from entering the house, so we use force as we're supposed to. So we pin him to the wall, we handcuff him, and we blindfold him. We throw him and his wife and his daughter into the room. This was a moment where the teachings of my rabbi from yeshiva popped in. We said a good Jew walks around with question marks around his head. And there were many question marks at that point towards the end of my service. And I went in after we settled into the house and had, scouting the window and protecting the front door. I went and sat down with this Palestinian. And he actually managed, in that moment in that house, I think, to open me up to what he is living through. And explain to me that almost every other night his house could be taken over. He doesn't know when. You don't need a warrant because it's military occupation. The fear for his daughter and his wife, just crossing from city to city or checkpoint to checkpoint. And he really managed to connect my action to a larger puzzle. What I thought was sort of a specific incident that I was experiencing and thinking I could be the best soldier in this incident, he said, it has nothing to do with your intentions. What's actually happening is a larger puzzle. And similar to me barging into his house, there were dozens and dozens of soldiers barging into homes or arresting or manning checkpoints. And sort of collecting or connecting that puzzle for me was key to later on try to take responsibility, which is what I'm trying to do here this evening today as well, and break my silence about what it is we were asked or ordered to do, or what I myself did, and what I myself ordered people to do.
Are you saying, though, that you're uncomfortable with that and that it's wrong? Because, of course, the criticism and the complaint that is made of you is that the Israeli army, the IDF, is central to the unity and strength of Israel, and that people like you are undermining that, that you're delegitimizing the army and the state of Israel. And I know you're frequently breaking the silence. Members are frequently called traitors. What do you say to that?
I mean, I would say yes, we're trying to delegitimize, but not Israel. We're trying to delegitimize the occupation. And I think that there's a very, very dangerous line that the current government, the Netanyahu administration, is pushing, which is basically saying, definitely to us Israelis, but also people around the world, Jewish diaspora, or anyone who's interested in what's happening in the region, if you want to support Israel, there's only one way, and that means that supporting Israel means supporting the occupation. And that's something I cannot accept. I am a proud Israeli. I see myself as an Israeli patriot. I am fighting to make my country a better place, but the occupied territories are not part of Israel. And I think those that try to erase the green line, and there's many in the Israeli government at this point, and they're part of those who accuse us of what you said, are trying to shut down this debate because they understand how weak their argument is. We're saying something very clear. Our support to Israel means our opposition to the occupation. So in order to support Israel today, 2018, you have to delegitimize the occupation. And I think in that sense, that's the best way to support Israeli soldiers, which I don't think are victims in this reality. I don't think I was a victim in what I did. But I think that soldiers are being put in a reality where there is no way to hold on to your morality. And that's something that we have to highlight and talk about and make clear. And I know that in the Australian community as a whole, the Australian Jewish community, it's many times this either or, right? Being pro-Israel means you have to be anti-Palestine or Palestinian, and being pro-Palestinian you have to be anti. And I think in that sense, what Breaking the Silence is trying to do is say our support for Israel means our opposition to the occupation. And those voices have to be amplified.
The truth is, though, you are a minority, and Israel is a democracy, and over you have Israelis electing governments that don't accept the sort of ideas you're putting forth. I mean, can't you accept, or don't you have to accept, that in a democracy you have to go with the will of the plurality?
You know, the houses that I entered in Nablus and Jenin were houses of non-Israelis. Right, the doctor in Nablus, or the old woman in Jenin that I almost scared to death, or the violence that I used on Palestinians because the Israeli society chose to maintain the occupation, the Israeli government was giving the military orders to do so, have no right to choose this government or that government. And in that sense, the Israeli occupation is not only an internal Israeli issue, where our decisions are affecting millions of other people. But I would also sort of add to that. You know, I walked around in the streets of Nablus and Jenin with M16 that said on it, "Colt, property of the USA government." Right? If you hear the voices coming out of Washington or the current Trump administration, or the blank check that the most right-wing government in our history is getting from Ambassador Friedman, and the inflammatory remarks he has said in the past about diaspora Jews criticizing Israel, in my eyes are not acceptable, but also I think show that the story is not only about the Israeli society. I know, as the director of Breaking the Silence, where I spend most of my energy, and that's in the Israeli society. You know, they're trying to close down public spaces for us. There's attempts to close schools from hearing us, or not allow students from hearing us, and we still find ways in because people are interested to hear. So it's true, we're not the majority voice of the Israeli society, but we're definitely a live and thriving voice which is fighting to make Israel a better place. And I think that part of what we try to do also in these visits is showcase that. I mean, the opposition voice in Israel, one who support the occupation, who want to maintain the status quo, you know, they're constantly coming to the Jewish communities around the world. They're constantly talking about basically selling this idea of permanent military occupation, and that's dangerous for me as an Israeli. So I think it's key for us fighting for our voices to be heard, to also realize that the decisions are not always made internally inside the Israeli society, but are affected by conversation happening outside as well.
Well, two things from that, and then we'll come to the authors. I mean, of course, that's what does upset people, and they say, why are you coming here to Australia and washing Israel's dirty linen in public? If you really cared about this, why wouldn't you want to change things from within? And the other thing, I think it's interesting, you say that's dangerous for you. Why is it dangerous for you? What is the danger for you in the occupation?
Well, I think that the notion that, which I think is growing, sadly, within the Israeli society, that we can maintain this reality of permanent military occupation is actually I think, starting a process that is pushing us from occupation to annexation. And this process that we've been seeing of the entrenchment of the occupation, as is visible from, just open the news, but, follow the many organizations that the New Israel Fund is supporting, read the different reports that we have published from soldiers serving there. There is an active attempt to shrink the number of Palestinians living in Area C, in the rural areas of the West Bank. There is an active attempt by this government to expand settlements and to authorize retroactively illegal outposts or unauthorized outposts. There is a dramatic change happening in the last couple of years that is permeating the status quo, but not in a way that will allow us in a few years, if we change the government, to say, well, let's flip this. But they're actually doing whatever they can to make sure this is irreversible.
And the fear in that is it existential or is it moral?
I mean, the fear in that is that the project of the State of Israel that my grandparents have fought for, that my parents have educated me to take a part in, is basically on its way to apartheid. And this has been said by former ministers, this has been said by former generals, and I think that this is a clear and present danger, right? If that's where we're going, right, if we believe former prime ministers or former foreign affairs ministers and prominent Israeli voices, that if we continue on this path, this is where we're heading, then anyone who cares for Israel, like I do, has to make sure that that's not where we're going.
I'm sure we'll come back to that. Let's talk to the Israeli, Asa. And you are actually the only Israeli contributor to the book, which again, like Breaking the Silence, is a collection of testimonies. And I'm wondering, Avner is often, and his Breaking the Silence colleagues are described often as traitors. You write very critically about things like the occupation. You write about the impact of suicide bombings on both sides, but you use humour. Does that save you, and is that why you use humour? Or do you come in for the same sort of criticism that you're attacking the State of Israel?
Like Avner said, I don't believe neither Breaking the Silence or me are criticizing Israel, but we're criticizing certain policies that certain governments have been carrying out through the years. Humor is a powerful way to deal with life, and specifically to deal with tough issues. And also, I think it's not really something I think about that much when I write. I think it just comes. That's my style of writing.
You just see the funny side in suicide bombings, and it's extraordinary.
Yeah. I mean,
I urge you to read it.
The challenge is for me, is to write an entertaining fiction, and that the reader, as myself as a writer, will have fun while they're reading it, but still manage to tackle serious issues without making fun of them.
No, you don't.
And without belittling the tragedies or the very hard conflicts and situations that we live through.
And I think what you do is you bring a lot of empathy to both sides of the events you talk about. In the book, you've chosen to write about soccer. Do you want to tell us why you did that, and how you see football affecting and being affected by the occupation, why it's important?
Yeah, so this collection, as Stephen explained in the beginning of the evening, is edited by Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman, who contacted 12 26, well, with them it's 26, they're going to do another 24 writers that they admire from all over the world, and offered them to come and see the occupation and write about what they see. Some of them came, you know, for the first time. Others have been you know, living in the region. Some of us are locals. I'm the only Israeli Jew, but there are 2 Israeli Palestinians and 1 Palestinian, and several Jewish writers like Geraldine, who's been in the region for many years. And the idea was to write about the occupation, about people we've met, about villages we saw, or to tackle a certain subject, and through it to shed a light about what the occupation means. And I chose soccer, football, and if we thought that it might have been a curious subject, then I invite everyone, when they get back home, not at this moment, to look at the headline of Haaretz at this moment, or every Israeli website at this moment. It's about soccer, it's about football, it's about how the occupation and politics are related to it. I'm referring, of course, to the cancellation of the match between Israel and Argentina that was supposed to take place on Saturday evening in Jerusalem. And the Argentinians announced today that they are canceling it, following pressure by the Palestinians, specifically by Jibril Rajoub, the head of the Palestinian Soccer Association, Football Association, who also plays a role in my essay. So my idea was to look at soccer, through soccer, at the occupation, and I do it on different levels. I'll mention 3. One is the basic control of Israel, of Palestinians' lives, and how it plays out through football. So, for example, the Palestinians, they have a soccer league. You know, they're trying to maintain an organized league, but they are dependent on Israeli permissions, for example, to move around. So there are many cases where entire teams are stopped on the way to matches, and then matches get cancelled. There are cases when suddenly tear gas is shot into a stadium during a match. There are cases of arrests during the night of players who then cannot move, and also there's a lot of restrictions of Palestinians moving out to international games. So that's one basic level of how, in one specific part of life, you can see how Israel has this control over Palestinians' lives. The second level is the national team, and how it is used as a kind of a symbol around which the Palestinian people can identify and can create a national identity that they cannot create in other walks of life, that they don't have the normal institutions that states have because they're not a state, but they do have the national team. And it's interesting how previously in history the same thing was done. For example, in Algeria, under French occupation, the national team existed before the Algerian state was founded, before they got their independence, and was used as a tool to unify the people, and also as a kind of a representative around the world in games and so on, creating awareness in the world to the Algerian cause for independence, in that case, and today the Palestinian. And the third level is what I mentioned previously, before, about the game, about Jibril Rajoub, the diplomatic level in which the Palestinians very cleverly use their power as a recognized entity within FIFA, the football association, the governing World Football Association. Palestine is a member, and they're not a recognized state in the UN, but being a member in FIFA is almost as powerful as being a state, because FIFA is such a big organization and powerful because so much money is invested in it. And through the membership in FIFA, they threaten Israel, who is violating all kinds of FIFA rules. So, for example, we have teams in the West Bank, in Jewish towns in the West Bank, settlements. This is not allowed under the basic FIFA rules. You cannot have a team in your league that is not in your territory. So, and then the Palestinians use this to kind of bring motions to try and kick Israel out, and this is causing a lot of stress to Israelis, all the way up to the Prime Minister, who one Friday, I remember, it was reported that he spent half an hour on the phone with the president of FIFA trying to persuade him to block such a Palestinian motion.
You make the point, and it's fascinating reflection on the power of soccer in this whole context, that someone like Jibril Rajoub, whose history, if you like, has followed the whole story of the occupation, you know, from PLO fighter to Arafat aide to comes back, and he's part of the security forces, and now you say he's in his most influential role ever. He's the chairman of the Palestinian Football Association, you know, for a team, for a country that doesn't really exist. It's extraordinary, and yet they're really gaining traction. We were going to read, but maybe we'll I'm not sure how much time we've got, but maybe we'll come to Geraldine and your perspective on this, because you're both an expert on the region, but a person who lives outside it. And I was struck reading the book that the authors actually say, well, the editors, you know, this was a book we didn't want to edit, we didn't want to write, we didn't even really want to think about it. We didn't want to have to think about Israel and Palestine. And then Ayelet Waldman says that she was born in Israel. After a while, she goes back after a long absence, and she realizes that she feels like she belongs there, and she loves Tel Aviv, and she loves the place. And then she somehow comes to the conclusion that because she feels so good and loves Israel so much, then she must also have some sort of measure of responsibility for what goes on there. And so I guess what I'm talking about is what people who are Jewish or from the diaspora, how they feel and what their responsibility is to what is going on. And I'm wondering, Geraldine, do you have that same sense of a reluctance to confront and yet also a sense of responsibility?
So, first of all, I would like to thank everybody who's here tonight for coming to take part in this conversation. And I was surprised by how many of my Jewish friends told me they couldn't come because they couldn't bear the discussion. And that seems very un-Jewish to me. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And yet we're not allowed to have an opinion on this one thing. And even though breaking the silence might not at this present moment be in the mainstream of Israeli opinion, I think it's very much in the mainstream of Jewish tradition of argument for the sake of heaven. I think about the 2 old rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, who couldn't agree on one single thing, and they argued vociferously with each other. But it was an argument for the sake of heaven because it was an argument in pursuit of truth. And so thank you all for being here to argue for the sake of heaven. For me, yeah, I was a bit when Ayelet called me, my first thought was I was a bit like the prophet Jonah. Every time God calls him, he wants to go away and take a nap, you know.
It's never good news.
I just was like, oh, I haven't been involved, you know, since I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I'll just share a little story about that. So when I was appointed by the Wall Street Journal to go and cover the Middle East, they brought me to Washington and they sent me for a round of briefings in Washington. They sent me to sit down with Reagan's national security advisor, and he gave me a walk through all the countries in the region that I would be covering and briefed me on what to expect. And we got to Israel-Palestine, and he said, well, you won't have to spend much time there because that Palestinian issue, it's nothing now. Those Palestinian kids, all they want to do is make some money and have a quiet life. That was in September 1987. I hadn't even fully unpacked my bag when the first Intifada erupted in Gaza, and it was the dominant story of my first year. And that is why American foreign policy is such a mess. But it's obviously a very intense story, and Deb covered it for the ABC for years, and you go from one side to the other. You feel strongly for people on both sides of the conflict. You perhaps see something that people locked in the conflict don't see so clearly, which is how much these two peoples have in common, and how amazing it would be if there were no occupation, if there was peace, and the promise of that. And it's so easy to get depressed and feel hopeless, but I think that's been true for every big convulsive social change. I mean, abolition of slavery was impossible until it wasn't. The civil rights movement was fighting against such entrenched values in the United States. And then all of a sudden, what seems impossible to change is changed. You can do anything. You can make any arrangements about territory and sovereignty that you want if you really want to do it. I mean, look at America. It's got a military base in Cuba. How could that be? You can do anything.
Arguing for heaven, as you say, and I know we will have, I hope we will have a very civilised and good debate and coming up with questions, but why do you think it is that it sometimes seems, or do you agree, that it sometimes seems harder to have those arguments in places like Australia and America than it actually is in America, in Israel?
Well, that's because Israel is, thank God, still a vibrant, loud, noisy democracy, and I hope it always will be.
And we're not?
No, there's a tremendous pressure, and look, I get it. Anti-Semitism is real and rising. And, you know, there are tremendous defamations of Israel all the time. And, you know, Europe is particularly disgraceful in this regard. But that's not what this is. You know, this is a discussion from a place of love and wanting to see Israel survive, because, let's face it, when there was no Jewish state, it didn't work out so well for the Jewish people. So we need Israel. But I think that there's more than one way to love Israel, more than one way to support it.
And as you've said, more than one Israel. Your story in the book reflects what you were mentioning before, which is the difference and yet similarity between two peoples. You want to tell us a little bit about the story and how you came to it and what it says?
So I was coming, you know, a lot of the writers who came hadn't been to Israel before, but I had the advantage of having been there. So my first thought was, I'm going to reconnect with people I knew here 26 years ago and see how the intervening years have changed their opinions, have changed their lives. So I went around met up with former sources of mine on both sides, and one person that I really wanted to reconnect with was an Israeli lawyer, Layat Semel. I profiled her for the Wall Street Journal in 1988 when she was defending Palestinians in the military courts of the First Intifada, and she's an Israeli attorney, born in Israel of Holocaust survivors, went into the army, went to law school. And after the '67 war, she said she was very naive and apolitical, and she thought it was a war for peace. But when she saw that it was actually a war leading to occupation, she changed the whole focus of her life and embraced the far left and became dedicated to defending Palestinian clients. And when I reconnected with her, she happened to be in the middle of a very high-profile and extremely poignant case of a young Palestinian who had gone with his slightly older cousin. He was 13, the cousin was 15. They had gone from their neighborhood just across the road to the Jewish neighborhood. They were neighbors, and taken knives and stabbed an Israeli child of 12. And so the older cousin had actually done the stabbing. He'd been shot at the scene. The younger one had been clubbed and had his skull fractured, and he was arrested and facing 20 years in prison. So she was defending him. So I took for my essay the story of these two families who lived so closely physically, but worlds apart. The two neighborhoods, Beit Hanina and Pisgat Zev. One is the second to last stop on the Jerusalem tram line, and the other is the last stop. And the only thing dividing these two neighborhoods is a great big expressway. But the division is in the way the people in those two neighborhoods are required to live because of the different status of occupied Palestinians and Israeli citizens of a democracy. But my focus was really the pain of these two families whose lives intersected in such a horrible way. In the Palestinian family, the mother couldn't believe that her little boy could do this thing. The whole family was nonplussed as to how this had happened. They're a kind of middle-class family. They weren't particularly radical in any way. None of them understood what had motivated the older cousin to convince his younger cousin to take these knives and do this thing. And, you know, once somebody in a family is involved in a terrorist incident, the whole family is impacted. So that family, and then the Israeli family was suffering terribly, even though, thank God, the boy Lior survived the stabbing and went on soon after to have his bar mitzvah, praise be. He's mentally still very much impacted by the trauma of the assault, and the whole family now has been really shattered by this. So I guess my essay was trying to look at the way everybody suffers through occupation.
There's a terrible ordinariness in the way it unfolds, and you've got one group of kids who are tired of being made, as they see it, to feel afraid, and they actually say to Leah that they wanted to go out and make the other kids feel afraid, and then it all just spirals into this terrible tragedy.
I think, you know, one of the saddest lines in the book is I was sitting with the uncle, and he's still trying to make sense of it, and he was saying, you know, I was an activist in the first Intifada, but, you know, I was a man. This is not the business of children. And then he started reflecting on his own childhood, and he said, you know, when I was their age, I would go to the park in West Jerusalem, the Bell Garden, and play with my Israeli friends. And this has become impossible in this one man's lifetime.
I was going to ask you about that later, but it's not a very happy way to end the session, so it's probably good to talk about it there. Now, we're going to open up for questions in a moment, so if you'd like to come down to the microphones, and that is questions. They're those short things. They have a question mark on the end. They're not a statement. They're not a political diatribe. They're actually questions where you are hoping to elicit something from our panel. So while you get yourselves organised, I actually do have a question perhaps to come back to Avner, and that is, how do you verify your testimonies, and even in your own case, case, I know, because this is such a heated issue. There are people on the internet who come up and say, well, you know, I served with him, and it's not true, because of course everyone does have a subjective experience of what they see. So it is largely subjective, but you know, you yourself have been described, there's quite a sort of mighty pile of videos on the internet saying he's a liar. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, just very quickly, something which I think is important to say. When I met, tying it to the book, I met Ayelet years back, and her initial response was really, you know, I had enough of Israel, but then she was invited to a book festival in Jerusalem, and I had the privilege of taking her to Hebron. But it was very important for us that there will be diverse people in the book. And it was key for us also to get Palestinian voices, Israeli-Palestinians and Palestinians. And I think it's just important to say that here on this stage we're Jewish. And this is sort of part of the New Israel Fund, sort of an internal conversation, I think, in that sense, which I think is important as well, to make sure we have this ability to have these conversations. But just noting that I encourage everyone to read the book and read the different.
Yes, thank you for making that point. That's a great
read
point.
The different voices, because it was very, very important for us for it to be multifaceted and definitely coming from a position of critical thinking of the occupation, but you will find inside the different essays different opinions, sometimes opposing opinions as well. So thank you for that question. I think that for the past 3 years now, end of 2015, Breaking the Silence, not alone, but Breaking the Silence has been sort of a target for attack by a bunch of organizations inside the Israeli society, but with deep links to the Israeli government. I encourage you guys to go online, look out for a video, just my name, of Avner Gvaryahu, and I think you'll find it in the New York Times, with me and 3 other leaders of human rights organizations, basically calling us liars, traitors, enemies from within. Together with Ayelet, who's the executive director of B'Tselem, Ishai Menuchin, the Committee Against Torture, and Siggy Ben-Ari, who's a human rights lawyer. I felt very proud to be in that esteemed crowd. But the interesting thing is the person that sort of thought of this very extreme campaign has deep ties, was a spin doctor of the education minister, Naftali Bennett. And the spokesperson for that campaign had ties to the Jewish Home, Naftali Bennett's party. So you really see this process. And yes, there were people who served alongside with me, that together with an organization, one of these organizations came out and criticized or questioned what I said. And I have to say, you know, this is part of what we're trying to do, to create this discourse. But the truth of the matter is that not one of my testimonies was found to be false. You know, just this week while I was in Sydney, someone who posted or wrote an op-ed saying he served alongside me shoulder to shoulder for 3 years and discredited me. If I'm accurate, during the next couple of days there's going to be an apology from the Jewish newspaper saying what he said was not accurate, because he actually didn't serve shoulder to shoulder with me for 3 years. But we're willing to hear the criticism. We stand by the facts and our testimonies. But just for you to understand how deep this goes, any person who has spoken publicly for Breaking the Silence was a target for an attack. I think one of the latest ones and most interesting and scary ones was our spokesperson, a young officer who served in Hebron, who shared his testimony publicly. I mean, you talked about the idea of anonymity of testimonies. Obviously, none of the soldiers are anonymous to us. We meet each and every one of them. But we have over 100 testifiers who have spoken publicly. Obviously, I'm not anonymous, but go onto our website, you'll find all of them. Very interesting, troubling, and important testimonies. And he, in a public event, spoke and shared his experience of using violence to arrest a Palestinian who was caught throwing stones. And this group, the same group that orchestrated the people who criticized me, the same people that orchestrated the letter that was published, basically brought about 15 people or 20 people from his unit all saying, "You're a liar, you're a liar, you're a liar." And they pushed they pushed the justice minister, through the defense minister, then the justice minister, to open up an investigation. We said this was a politicized investigation, but the state attorney actually did open up an investigation, and a few months later came out with headlines saying, "We found him to be a liar." We actually managed in 2 days of research to totally flip that and bring forward evidence that showed that none of the people who called him a liar were in that specific incident he talked about. And the Palestinian that the state attorney or the police claimed to be the Palestinian that was beaten up and said he was never beaten up, they actually interrogated the wrong Palestinian. And the state attorney came out just a few months ago with a statement saying they reopened the case. And I think that it has been pretty chilling to us as political activists, who have done this for a while, but still have this trust in the system that there are gatekeepers that know what their job is. And the truth of the matter is that there is a dangerous trend being led by right-wing politicians, and we see this with attacks on Supreme Court and the media and minorities. I mean, it's definitely not breaking the silence. Just recently, a week ago, the head of Mossad came out in an interview saying anyone who opposes the views of Netanyahu is seen and called a traitor. This is a former head of Mossad. Sort of the equivalent to our CIA. So there are dangerous trends, and we are an example of those trends. But in that sense, that's why it's so important for us to get support from Israelis, and it's by the thousands. It's so important for us to get support from communities outside of Israel. We're all for this open discussion and open debate. That's what it's about. But in the end of the day, there's no way to hide a 51-year military occupation. This is what it looks like. And what we're calling for is taking responsibility.
Let's have some open discussion and debate. We've got a question over here. If you'd like to come to one of the microphones, rather than putting your hand up, I'll ask you to come. There's a microphone over here, but we'll start over here. Yep.
Thank you very much to the authors, all 26 of you, for your book. I look forward to reading more of it. Thank you to Breaking the Silence for doing just that, breaking the silence. I've done volunteer work in Israel and Palestine for many, many years. In fact, I just returned from a really traumatic week in Jerusalem around the 10th through the 16th of May. And I visited Hebron and all of its awful stuff. My question is, in the diaspora, in America, in Australia, I'm a citizen of both, the Jewish community seems to get incredibly upset about equal access to the Western Wall. And yet there is so much silence or antipathy against the occupation. It's like, it's the way it has to be. And I don't understand, and I look to you to help me understand, why is it that Jews can get so upset about a thing, a wall, no matter how ancient it may be, and not get upset about the lives of the Israelis and the Palestinians that are being destroyed by the occupation?
Well, thank you. Who'd like to take that? Assaf?
Everybody, I hope.
I think it's, I can understand as the sense of protection, of trying to protect something that is valuable for Jewish people around the world. I of course cannot answer for them because I am not one, but obviously, I acknowledge that it comes from a place of caring and try to protect, and obviously being far away. Being far away, I think there is a tendency among probably, well, I wouldn't say the majority actually, because in the United States it's not. But to see the way Israel behaves and the way it's been led as the right way. You know, the Israel, you know, this idea which has a lot of justification, which is, that is surrounded by enemies and by people who would like to see it, you know, attacked and maybe stop existing. And it needs to protect itself, and this is what it does. And if it does it, then we're behind it. But you know, the conversation must be much wider than this, because we're it's not leading to any place that actually is for the advantage of Israel and its future.
Geraldine, do you have a brief comment?
I'll just, yeah, well, so my rabbi is very much involved in Women of the Wall, and she went to pray there with a group of women, and they arrested their Torah. They took their Torah off them and they put it in a police car, because women aren't allowed to be carrying a Torah. And it's on a spectrum, really, of what kind of society is Israel? Is it pluralistic? Is it egalitarian? But it should be. That's the dream, right? And my rabbi is also very much involved with Rabbis for Human Rights and their work in the occupied territories. So I don't think it's a dichotomy.
Okay, thank you. We've got a lot of questions, so we might move on and take one from this side.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear?
Stand a bit closer.
I am standing closer. I don't think the mic's on. That's it. Okay, it's on. Good. Thank you. My question is around this idea of indefinite occupation and the fact that there's this sort of tacit understanding that this, well, it's the longest occupation in modern history. My question is, would you not call it colonisation? If it looks and acts like colonisation, then that in fact is what it is. From the standpoint of someone who's very critical of Israel and not afraid to say it, I have Jewish heritage, my father's Jewish, you know, at what point does the community here and the community around the world say, no, this has to stop? And I fully respect breaking the silence and have done the tour in the South Hebron Hills with them and read a lot of their material, and their bravery and their work in Israel and outside of Israel is to be highly commended. So my question is, let's not call it an occupation. It is a brutal, vicious occupation, we know that, but it is also a colonisation, and the end point is to take all of the land which is called the land of Judah and Samaria, whatever.
Okay, thank you.
My other question, just one...
No, one question at a time. I think we've got a whole lot of people. We'll just have, do you mind? We'll just have one question, and I might just ask Avner to tackle that.
Yeah, I mean, I can try. I use the word occupation, and we talk about the occupation from '67. We were questioned or criticized sometimes. Why not call 48 occupation? We talk about '67. That's where we're focusing, and I think specifically, maybe more deeper than that, in Breaking the Silence, we will make the distinction between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Jewish-Arab conflict, and the occupation. And I think, which is a little beside your point, but I think it's important because when we talk about the conflict, I look back to my own roots Right? I'm a ninth generation Israeli. My grandmother is from a very old Jerusalemite family, and I have Palestinian friends who have roots as deep as that. And I think that there is a conflict, which I hope we can resolve. I hope it will be, I will live to see it. But I think that part of that ongoing conflict, there's one aspect of it, which is the Israeli military occupation. And I think that at this point, that is definitely the accurate word to use. I said where I think we are going, and I'm definitely not an expert in history or sociology. I think I can talk about what I did, and I think that's, for me, when I think about the actions that I did and the way it is structured or explained, I think that for me that word explains exactly what it is I was asked to do. But that's my choice.
Also, if I can just say, it doesn't really matter what you call it. You can call it the pink donkey. It just needs to be stopped.
But, I mean, it is also the case, isn't it, and this is something Avner was referring to, that the big donkey or whatever, the demographic tipping point has probably already been reached. You're now at a point where there are fewer people imposing their will upon a larger number of people. I mean, is that something that has changed awareness in Israel?
It's been talked about as a major issue, but again, it's even we start going into that. So the right will bring other statistics, and this will bring this statistics. Of course, that it's a problem for those who claim to be able to have one state, one democratic state. So they start, making the calculations, but we're so far away. That's one of the things I think about breaking the silence that I admire, is that they're not really concerned about solution. It's not their role to find the right solution. They are doing a very specific job in opening eyes of people, in showing people what is being done.
Perhaps
what will happen after that, that's for others to
Yep. Okay, that is a more realistic goal. Perhaps a question over here.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting evening and discussion. And thank you, Avner, for bringing up the whole issue of the status of Israel proper within the Green Line, and this whole question of, how the issues to be resolved. And the Israeli organization Sochrot very much emphasizes the Nakba and 48 and the question of the original dispossession. And it's very parallel to what we have in Australia.
Now, have you got a question?
Yes,
I'll just
I
push
have
you
a question.
to get to a question.
I have a question, and the question is, how do you see this issue of the Nakba being dealt with, and do you see it as something that is crucial for the resolution of the conflict, which, as you say, is bigger than simply stopping the occupation?
Geraldine, would you?
Oh, thanks for nothing.
Would you like to take that simple little question?
I can only say that we need a Jewish state. History has shown that we need a Jewish state. So I don't think that it's necessary to not attempt to redress the injustices that have been done. But for me, the argument stops when you question the legitimacy of Israel within the Green Line.
Can I add something?
Please.
Yeah, I would just quickly add something to that. I think that for me, as I live in Tel Aviv. I have friends who are Jewish and I have friends who are Muslim. I'm not scared of them. They're not scared of me. I think there has been in past history, recent histories, ability of Jews and Muslims and Christians living side by side. I think that the pressing issue and this is where I go back to the conflict versus occupation, is this idea, which I think is permeating inside the Israeli society and is petrifying me, that we can have a permanent military control over another people. And that's where I believe, that's where we're trying to focus the energy. And I think there's many, there's wide conversations that have to be had, Nakba versus independence, and what 48 was, go back to 1929, or 1897, refugees. These are all very important questions. But when I look at what's happening to the Israeli society, when I see violence towards Palestinians, the pressing issue has to be, in my mind, ending this military control over another people.
Question over here.
I want to address this to Avner. You speak about and give yourself credit for breaking the silence. But in a court of law, when one takes an oath, you are asked to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, you may or may not have spoken the truth. I don't want to question that. But you have not spoken the whole truth. The silence you have assiduously maintained is the broader picture, the picture of the other side. Geraldine Brooks is the only one that for a moment, 2 moments, opened a little window and allowed some of that in. The genocidal anti-Semitism, the rejectionism on the other side. Now within that context, you are maintaining a silence. It's not good enough to say, I'm a part worker. I just work on this little part. And the work that you're doing, I come from South Africa, as some people might have guessed. I worked in Israel advocacy for years. I debated the Minister of Intelligence in the South African government on a public stage. And here's my question.
Yeah?
I know the guys from BDS. BDS have now found their way into the South African government. The other day...
Is this a question? Can we...
It is a question.
We'll just get to the question.
It's a question. I'll raise my voice at the end.
Let's go there. Yep.
A blight on humanity is what a government spokesman called Israel the other day. Now, I want to know, and this is my question, how do you hold yourself accountable for the damage you're doing out there? And you are, whether you know it or you don't, whether it's witting or unwitting.
Okay, thank you. Well, we might stop there. I mean, I don't know if that is a question or a statement, but do you want to respond to it, Avner?
I mean, I'll try, and I'd be happy to continue this conversation afterwards. In breaking the silence, we question often, what we do. And as you can guess, and as you guys can imagine, this isn't the first time we've heard questions like this or accusations, right? I mean, is what we're doing actually fueling hatred? And I have to say with full honesty, this is something that we think about. And this is something that we fear. And I would say that, throughout the years, one of the things that has come up in a very strong way is we understand that there might be people that will distort our message. And I'll explain exactly what our message is to this fine crowd. But the price of keeping silent is much higher. Now we can disagree. We can disagree, but as someone who is fighting for the soul of the state of Israel, I believe that the most clear and present danger we are facing is the permanent military occupation. Now, I'll just say this, on the terms of BDS, we don't support BDS, and we're not supported by BDS because we're an Israeli organization. I also don't think that it's the boogeyman that some people make it out to be, but I would say this. It looks like, from where I'm standing, and I said part of this before, but there's a voice coming out of the Israeli government saying, you want to support Israel, support the occupation. And there's an opposite voice which is feeding into that, which is saying, if you want to oppose the occupation, you have to oppose Israel. And there's a voice in the middle. And it's not only breaking the silence, but it's also breaking the silence. It's also many organizations supported by the New Israel Fund, and I know it's many of the people sitting around here, because I've spoken to many of you. It's a voice that says, as I've reiterated over and over again, that our support for Israel means opposing the occupation. And I think that the importance of that message cannot just stay here in Sydney and end in this evening. But it's up for the people in this community to make sure that voice is amplified, and that there's more groups and organizations like the New Israel Fund. And you see examples of this in the US and in England and in Canada and in some European countries, where once you can expand that conversation and say there is a space for an alternative view on Israel, right? And amplifying Israeli voices who are saying we're doing this because we believe Israel has to end the occupation for its sake, then what you do is you actually strengthen that and weaken the two other sides. Now, if you buy into this narrative that says you can either be anti-Israel, right, or you have to be pro-occupation, then practically you're wrong, because there's many more different views in Israel that are represented in parliament. And tactically, I think you're wrong, because what you're doing is you're actually feeding into the people you're saying you're opposing, right? So I would wait, just
hold on. I think you've had your turn. We just let Avner finish. Do you want to finish that?
Yeah, and I would just say that, you know, there throughout the past couple of years, with a heavy attack on breaking the silence, attempts to minimize our funding and prevent us from entering schools and defund public spaces who host us, as I said, we have a wave of people supporting us. Some of these people supporting us, people have much more military experience than me, are, you know, former admirals or generals, 2 former heads of Secret Service, military judges, but also Israel Prize winners, professors, academics. There's a discussion going on in Israel, right? Just 2 Fridays ago in the center of Tel Aviv, hundreds of Israelis flocked out in support of us, reading soldiers' testimonies. The amount, you know, go online to see the people who read this, right? They are genuine representatives of the Israeli society. The fact that we're not the majority does not mean our voice is right. And I would add this, in order to make sure this kind of debate continues and not only a polarized debate, then there has to be more work done throughout the year, right? Keep challenging yourself.
I suppose you're not the only country where we're all getting a sense that there might be a disconnect between what a lot of ordinary people are saying and what the leaderships seem to be saying. So you're not alone there. I think we've got time for one more question over here. Are you, oh, this lady, sorry. And then we'll come to you, and then that will be it.
I would like to thank our guests, not only for being here, but for a job which, in my view, is being very well done. I believe in my daily review of the electronic and the print media that the silence has been well and truly broken, and that many people who in the past have supported the occupation from a military point of view no longer support it morally. So I'm wondering, with your permission, Debbie, because fear of the unknown looms very large, could we reframe the discussion, and could each of our guests, in a few words, outline some initiatives that might be taken to withdraw from the occupation without endangering the existence of Israel?
Well, yes. Take it away. Perhaps you should have come up here and said that right at the beginning. I'm sorry. That's, yes.
I'll say
what to do?
2 practical things. Someone mentioned women of the wall, right? So I'd say, first of all, we should make sure we understand there's more than one wall we have to care about, you know, in Israel-Palestine. And Women of the Wall is a very interesting case study, because most Israelis on the left right, who could, could connect or bridge those two communities, don't really care about women praying at walls, because many of them are secular and don't fully understand why there's, why that became the fight. But because this was a issue that the diaspora community cared about, it made Israelis care about it. So I would say, what is the women of the wall of the occupation? Right? What is that cause you can find? Is it lack of water and electricity in Palestinian communities in Area C? Is it the fact that in the main street of Hebron, Palestinians can't leave the front door of their house because the street is sterilized, as soldiers call it? What is that issue? Is it children detention? What is that issue you can choose and rally around and talk about and write op-eds about and push people with? And that's been done very, very well with Women of the Wall. So that's one thing I would put in front of you. And the second very practical thing is copy some of the tools that the right has been using, right? David Friedman, the American representative, the U.S. representative to Israel, was part of Friends of Beit El. He supported the settlement project years before he was appointed. And there's many of these sister friends groups, right, connecting, linking communities to each other. And there's so many organizations that work with local Palestinian communities. Find a local Palestinian community and learn about it, understand it, invite the people here, or go yourself there and create those links. There's Israelis and Palestinians who have the ties. It's very easy, practical. There's a bunch of communities trying to do this as we speak in the UK and in the US very successfully. And that's a practical way to say we are supporting a community together with Israelis and Palestinians for the future, right? Because it is very clear that the existence of these communities is key for any sort of resolution. So just strengthening these communities, I think is very important, but also imagine, Palestinians growing up in a community where it says that their school was donated by this or that synagogue in Sydney. I mean, what change that does, what openness that creates, and what that does in the synagogue in Sydney, that they know that there are Palestinians that are now going to school in a place that they were connected to. So there's two practical ideas that I leave for you.
Okay. So they don't see the own experience as being someone who comes in and takes over their house and locks them in the bedroom. Geraldine, it's practical?
Practical. So it says in the Tanakh, don't make war on trees. It's a great sin to make war on a tree, and yet trees are burned and cut down as what they call price tag acts by settlers all the time, and this is people's livelihood. So I think Rabbis for Human Rights initiative to go into Palestinian communities and replant olive groves is one practical way to support that initiative. But I also think to become informed about, I'm not a strategic expert or a military person, but there are 270 military commanders in Israel who have come out to say that the occupation is a threat to Israel's security. Commanders for Israel's security? Yeah. Also, I think many of you might have seen the wonderful documentary Gatekeepers, where 6 former heads of Shin Bet came out to say that the occupation is indeed the threat to Israel's security. So I think listen to them, because they're the guys who have real strategic answers to these questions.
Yeah. The question was how to ensure Israel's safety after a withdrawal, right?
I think we're looking for practical things.
Okay, so
we can do.
The way to ensure Israel's safety is with the strongest army, definitely in the Middle East, one of the strongest in the world, with a powerful air force and allegedly even some nuclear power. The occupation just breeds more hatred, breeds more threat, There's a war every few years. There's a round of violence every couple of years. There's missiles. The Prime Minister claims that the Iranians are just seconds away from destroying us. So I really don't understand the question. The way things are now are not safe for Israel or for Israel's future, and especially they actually say they breed more anti-Semitism. That's what breeds the hatred, not breaking the silence. The occupation and the way we are humiliating millions of people. That breeds the hatred and the support all over the world. Yes, it is. It's not breaking the silence, saying what they did in the army. I was in the army. I don't know if you were. I was in the Israeli army in Gaza, and I saw the same thing. And this is why I don't have even a question whether they are lying or not lying, because I was there, and I know this is the occupation. The occupation is dangerous. How will we protect Israel? We have the strongest army, and we will have justification. Now we don't have the justification because of the occupation. So this is
I think the question also was asking, is there something practical that you would suggest could be done to bring the occupation to an end,
That I don't know.
To remedy. Didn't you make a computer game that was about bringing peace to the Middle East?
Well, the computer game, it's a good question, because the computer game, you played as either the Prime Minister of Israel or the Palestinian president, and you needed to negotiate the different barriers and the different obstacles to peace. That's being a good politician. This is what we need.
Politics. No, well, there's a long story. We've got time for one more question, I think, over here. Make it a nice one.
Yeah, I'll try to make it short. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Avner, I was listening to you several times also at Columbia University. I think it was really important to listen to what you guys are doing. Not necessarily because I agree with what you do. I just think it's great to see how Israel's democracy, keep developing. We try to be better and better. I have to say that as a soldier, I served also in Gaza, I served in Lebanon, I served in Kastlad and so forth. I lost a lot of good friends because of trying to be ethical or trying to do the right thing. I can say that, I can't say we're perfect, but I know we're trying. I don't know if you remember, but after basic training, when you get your weapon, you sit with your commander and they talk about situation, what you should do, what you should not do. You're presenting it as if it's black and white, but things are really complicated in the battlefield. It's not that you can take the right decision all the time. You have time to think even. And if you do try to think for too long, you can lose your friend or you could lose your life as well. My question is that we're so good at criticizing ourselves, right, all the time. In Israel, you can see people demonstrate in the middle of Tel Aviv, against Netanyahu. We're sitting right here, criticize ourselves, right now. My question is, do you ever see the Palestinian side criticize themselves the way we criticize us? Do you think that we can see some sort of breaking the silence on the other side of the border?
Elad, right?
Yes.
Thank you for that. So, first of all, I'd love to meet when you're back in Israel and we could go sit down with some of these Palestinians. Groups like Combatants for Peace or the Bereaved Family Forum, which I think is one of the most inspiring organizations. There's one of the stories, one of the essays in the book, is it by Colum?
Yeah. Colum
McCann wrote about wrote about two parents, about Rami El-Hanan, who lost his daughter to a terrorist attack, and about the Palestinian father, Bassam Aramin, that lost his daughter to a mistaken bullet by a soldier. And they work together. They're the best of friends. Just 2 weeks ago, I saw them both on the way to a meeting on a motorcycle. And there's dozens. I just saw Rami just posted, go on his Facebook page now, Rami El-Hanan, he just posted they're opening another weekend, and the Palestinian side is already full. They're looking for the Israelis. Now, they're not the only organizations, and there's lists, and there's Palestinians working on either side, but I'm an Israeli. I'm not Palestinian. And I would just say, you know, to your point, yes, I agree. I don't disagree. It's complicated. And we both lost friends fighting. Friends of ours were injured. Maybe you were injured. I mean, maybe not physically, maybe mentally, right? I mean, this is part of what we're carrying as a society. And I think what Breaking the Silence says, and what I'm here to say this evening, is that I'm not blaming you, but I'm taking responsibility. And I'm saying, look, this is what I was asked to do. And I actually believe, and we've said this over and over again, but the problem is not the individual soldier. The problem is not how you act. Because you're right, there's so many situations, and you'll find this in our testimonies, where there wasn't a right way to act. We're not trying to make the occupation more moral. We're trying to end it. Right? We believe that the system is problematic, not the individuals within the system. And when we talk about our experience, when we talk about the testimonies we gather, we're talking about our own experiences. We're talking about what we were asked to do. And I think that I really recommend and encourage people, go onto our website, follow us on Facebook and Twitter and get our newsletters, but read some of the testimonies. Read some of the testimonies from Protective Edge. Read some of the testimonies from Cast Lead. I promise that if you'll read them, you'll find that complexity that you experienced. And I agree, it's not black and white. But what I would say is black and white is this idea that we can continue to control another people by force. That's something we cannot accept. And part of what Breaking the Silence does, what not only as an organization, but silence breaking as a whole, it stirs things up. And that's what we need, because things are so stagnated at this point. And that's our mission.
If I can add just one last thing.
Can I just?
Yeah, I did read most of the
Thank
testimonies.
you.
Can I just say two quick things?
Yeah.
Breaking the Silence is not about the heat of the moment when you have to take a decision and maybe you make a mistake, and this is totally acceptable. It's not about that. It's about structured routine, like Straw Widow that he described. This is not a heat of the moment decision when you don't have time to think. This is a structured, organized military occupation of millions of people. And the second thing is that I don't think it's a symmetrical situation. To go and say, oh, what about the other side? That's you can do that, but we are the ones with the power, and we are the ones who are calling the shots. So to ask for this symmetry, I think that's wrong.
You're not saying people... You're not against people serving in the army, per se, are you? Or the need for an army?
Oh yeah, we're not pacifists. I mean, there might be members of Breaking the Silence who are, but that's not who we are as an organization. We call for knowledge, right? We think people have to know, and the solution will not come from an individual soldier. That's why most of our energy is focused to the public, right? It's not about, this or that soldier, but it's about people knowing and having the ability to change that reality for the sake of soldiers as well, but definitely for the ones they're occupying.
I can see that our time is running out. Liam.
I think let's start. Can you hear me? There we go. I think we should start by just giving a very big thank you to these wonderful people.